They thought he was just a janitor, old, limping, invisible. But every Sunday without fail, he drove out to a forgotten cemetery and knelt by the same grave. No family, no flag, just six quiet words. You're not forgotten. Not this week. Then one morning, he didn't come home. And when the Pentagon opened the envelope in his coat, what they found shook Arlington to its core. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. They found him just after sunrise, lying still at the base of an old grave, one hand wrapped around the stems of crushed wildflowers, the other pressed gently against the faded stone like it meant something, like it was the last thing that mattered. His name was Raymond Navarro, 72, janitor at Hillside Regional High, quiet man, never married, no children, lived in a small trailer off Route 6, paid his bills on time, picked up extra shifts when the younger staff called out. No one knew much else. That morning, when the sun finally pushed through the fog rolling over the hills of Elmwood Cemetery, it cast a pale light across Raymond's still body. His coat was soaked from the damp grass. His hat, an old navy ball cap, had blown a few feet away, caught in the brambles. His face was peaceful, not frozen, just done. Officer Thomas Baylor was the first to arrive. He crouched beside the old man, eyes scanning the scene the way he'd been trained to. No sign of trauma, no struggle, just a man who had laid himself down and let go. But then he saw it peeking out from Raymond's coat pocket. An envelope, worn, yellowed, edges curled from time. No address, no name, only 6 words written in shaky block letters: to B Company, 3rd Battalion. Thomas hesitated. Carefully, he pulled it free. The inside was empty, but tucked behind it, folded 3 times and sealed with brittle tape, was something else. A folder. On the cover, in faded ink to be opened only in the event of death, Thomas stood up slowly. The headstone Raymond had died beside was cracked, half swallowed by weeds, the name barely visible beneath lichen in years of acid rain. Lieutenant J. M. Moore, USMC, KIA, 1968. It was a name Thomas didn't recognize, but he felt a strange chill, something more than the October wind. Raymond Navarro hadn't just died. He'd finished something. The call to the Pentagon came 3 hours later. Standard protocol. Per department policy, a veteran passes in unknown circumstances. A sealed folder marked for military attention. A specific unit named. You make the call. The woman on the other end answered calmly at first. Then Thomas read the name on the envelope. She went silent. Repeat the coordinates of the grave, she said. Thomas did. Stay where you are, the voice replied. Someone's coming. Click. He stood there in the cemetery, autumn wind curling around him like fingers. The graveyard was quiet except for the distant rush of highway traffic and the occasional flutter of a crow's wings overhead. He looked down at Raymond again. A janitor. Just a janitor. But now, suddenly, the Department of Defense was listening. Raymond Navarro wasn't someone you noticed unless you had to. Every morning at 6:00 a.m., he pushed his mop down the echoing halls of Hillside Regional, cleaned the cafeteria floors before the first bell rang, replaced light bulbs, fixed leaky faucets, wiped graffiti off lockers before anyone else saw it. Most students didn't know his name. Teachers called him Ray, or Sir, if they were feeling respectful. The vice principal once asked if he was medically cleared to still be working, said something about safety. Raymond had just nodded and kept cleaning the windows. He limped a little when he walked, just enough to make people uncomfortable. His khaki uniform was always clean, tucked in with military precision. Wireframe glasses, same blue ball cap every day, always polite, always quiet, but every Sunday, while most of the town was still sleeping off church or football or whatever passed for family time in Millvale, New Hampshire, Raymond drove 15 miles out toward Route 19, past the old truck stop, up the gravel path behind the lumberyard, to a cemetery no one used anymore. Elmwood Cemetery had been decommissioned in the late 90s. Grass was knee-high most of the year. Fences sagged. Half the names had faded into stone. No one visited, not anymore, except for Raymond Navarro. Every Sunday, no exceptions. He'd park by the rusted gate, always locking his car, always carrying a small bouquet wild marigolds when he could find them, dandelions sometimes, or daisies picked from the shoulder of the road. He never told anyone where he was going. He never took pictures, never posted online. No selfies, no hashtags, just one man, one grave, Lieutenant J. Moore. He would clear the moss, wipe away dirt with his sleeve, pull up vines by hand, and then, every single time, he'd lean forward and say the same 6 words, "You're not forgotten. Not this week." That was it. Then he'd sit on the grass beside the grave, sometimes scribble into a worn leather notebook, sometimes just stare at the trees, watching them shift in the breeze like old soldiers trying to remember who they used to be. What most people never knew, what no one knew, was that Raymond had never met Lieutenant Moore. He wasn't a brother, not a cousin, not even in the same unit. He found the grave by accident, 10 years earlier, while looking for his cousin's plot. The name, the silence around it, the absence of any flag or flower. It didn't sit right with him. A Marine, dead in 1968, no family, no visits, no one left to remember. So Raymond Navarro decided if no one else would remember him, he would. One Sunday, then another, then every week, through snow, through illness, even after his mild stroke, even when the VA stopped returning his calls, every single Sunday. He never said why. He didn't have to. Some debts aren't written in ink. Some aren't even owed by name. They're carried in silence, in loyalty, in the belief that a grave left alone is a promise broken. Thomas Baylor stared down at the field report in his cruiser. Raymond Navarro, janitor, deceased. Unclaimed veteran folder initiated. Possible classified content. Awaiting federal response. The last sentence chilled him. Subject identified as recipient of multiple combat citations. Unregistered. Thomas leaned back in the seat, eyes drifting out toward the cemetery fence. Somewhere, far beyond his pay grade, someone had just sat up straight at a desk. And for the first time in decades, the name James M. Moore was echoing through the walls of the Pentagon, not as a statistic, but as a Marine remembered. Because one old man refused to forget, they buried Raymond Navarro 4 days later. No family came forward, no official next of kin. The town paid for a simple service, closed casket, military flag draped over the wood, a borrowed bugler playing taps from a Bluetooth speaker because the real brass section was overbooked that week. Thomas Baylor stood in the back row. He didn't know why exactly. He hadn't known Raymond well. He only nodded to him once or twice near the school. But since that morning at the cemetery, something had shifted inside him. Like a wire had been tugged loose. Like Raymond's silence had cracked open something older than memory. The envelope had stayed with him, the one with no name. Only the words "To Be Company, 3rd Battalion." Thomas turned it over in his coat pocket now, standing beneath a gray October sky as the local pastor said a few quick words. The wind was cold, not biting, just steady, like it had a purpose. He watched as the casket was lowered. No rifles fired, no folded flag handed to a grieving widow, just the sound of ropes squeaking through gloved hands and the dull thud of earth waiting to close. And then it began. It started with a photograph. A jogger named Maggie Wright had passed through Elmwood Cemetery 2 weeks earlier, cutting her morning run short because of a pulled tendon. She paused to stretch at the rusted gates. That's when she saw him, an old man kneeling into the grass, one hand pressed to a weather-worn headstone, the other clutching a bunch of wild marigolds like they meant more than flowers ever should. She didn't take the picture to be cruel. She just felt something. Man visits same forgotten grave for 10 years. Every Sunday. No flag, no fanfare. She posted it on her blog with a caption, "Maybe some heroes don't need medals. Just a place to remember." The post had 3 views when she went to bed, By morning, it had 40,000, 2 days after the burial. Thomas sat in his cruiser scrolling through his phone when his inbox pinged. Subject urgent request from DOD. It was real, official, stamped. They wanted the coordinates again, details about the headstone, a full transcript of Raymond's last known interactions. They asked for the coroner's notes, the police report, even the name of the jogger. And then they asked the question that shifted everything. Was the envelope intact? Thomas felt his pulse kick. He hadn't told them about the second item yet, not just the envelope, the folder, the one labeled to be opened only in the event of death. It had been tucked into Raymond's coat lining, sealed with red wax, the edges worn soft like it had been folded and unfolded hundreds of times. Thomas hadn't dared open it, not without cause, not without authorization. Now, with the green light from federal brass, he did. Inside was a file that didn't belong to someone like Raymond Navarro. At least, not the version the world had known. Navarro, Raymond alias, DOB, August 18, 1951, enlistment OSMC upon 1969, deployment Maskbisog, Laos 1971, top secret clearance, service record redacted, 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 medals 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Silver Star, commendation from Maj Gen. Alton Frey missing since '74. Last active duty assignment unknown. But the last page held the one thing Thomas hadn't expected. A note, handwritten, simple, not addressed to anyone specific. I didn't save him, but I never forgot him. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. That night, Thomas sat on the edge of his bed, the file laid open like scripture in his lap. He stared at the words, trying to reconcile the man in the mop-streaked hallways with the one described on paper. It didn't make sense. Raymond Navarro had been a ghost in their town background noise in a world too busy to ask questions. But now his file was on a federal watch list. Now the Pentagon had flagged him as Tier 1 deceased veteran. Now the entire country was starting to remember a man who had spent decades making sure someone else wasn't forgotten. The next morning, Thomas drove out to Elmwood. The gate creaked just like before. The air was damp, fog clinging low to the ground. He stepped carefully through the overgrown path, boots pressing into soft earth until he reached the grave. Lieutenant James M. Moore, USMC, KIA, 1968. There were new flowers there now. Dozens, wild and fresh and placed gently in a half moon around the stone like sentinels. Someone had cleaned the marker, the moss scraped away, the lettering recarved, a small American flag tucked into the soil. And on the stone, just beneath Moore's name, someone had chalked a line in neat block letters, not forgotten. Not this week. Thomas stared, then knelt. He didn't know much about Moore, only what Raymond had left behind. But the deeper he looked, the more the story bled through the pages of redacted reports and faded ink. Moore had been a first lieutenant in the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, served during the Tet Offensive. Part of a reconnaissance unit that went dark near the Laos border in June 1971, only one survivor had been recovered from the ambush. A man pulled from the jungle with a head wound, a shattered arm, and no memory of how he made it to the evac site. That man was Raymond Navarro. The official report claimed Moore died in action. No remains were recovered. The mission was sealed. But Thomas suspected Raymond had never needed the report to tell him the truth. He remembered, he carried it. Not as guilt, but as duty. Every Sunday, for 10 straight years, Raymond had stood in the place where no one else would. Not because it brought him peace, but because it didn't. That was the point. To keep showing up anyway, to keep saying, even in silence, I'm still here. And so are you. Later that week, Thomas received another call, this time from someone higher up, way higher, an aide to a 4-star general. They asked if he was familiar with Raymond Navarro. Thomas said yes. The aide's voice was quiet. There's going to be a review, he said. The secretaries asked for a briefing. A briefing? Thomas echoed. Yes, on Moore, Shudar, and on the man who kept him alive in memory longer than anyone else could. The call ended with a final request. Please keep the grave secure. There's a team inbound. Thomas hung up, staring at the now quiet line. He thought of the old man in the khaki uniform, of the flowers, of the silence, and of one simple truth. Some men disappear quietly, but others leave echoes behind them so loud. Even the Pentagon eventually has to listen. By the time the convoy reached Millvale, the town had already heard the rumors. Black SUVs rolling past the gas station. Marines in full-dress blues spotted near the courthouse. A federal sedan parked outside the funeral home. Thomas Baylor stood on his porch, coffee gone cold in his hand, watching the slow procession of silence and rank wind its way up Main Street. It wasn't official yet, but everyone knew something big was coming. Not for a senator, not for a mayor, for a janitor. It was nearly dusk when they came to Raymond Navarro's trailer. No press, no announcement, just two Marines, one tall, clean-shaven, eyes like granite, and an older officer whose left eyebrow carried a scar that split it clean through. They knocked twice. Thomas opened the door, still in uniform. "I've been keeping it locked up," he said quietly. "Didn't want anyone poking around." The older officer nodded once. "Thank you, Officer Baylor. May we come in?" They stepped into the trailer like men entering a chapel. Not a word was wasted. On the table still sat the folder. Beside it, the photograph Thomas had found tucked into the back pages, a black and white shot of 6 Marines, soaked to the bone, smiling like men who'd just cheated death. Moore was at the center, his hand on Navarro's shoulder, helmet tilted, that crooked grin of his, frozen in time. The tall Marine reached for the photo and held it gently, like it might tear from memory if handled wrong. "We saw the post," he said, "the one of Raymond at the grave." Thomas nodded. "Someone recognized the name." The officer continued. "Then the photo led us to you." The scarred Marine pulled a document from a slim leather folder and slid it across the table. It bore the insignia of the Department of Defense. Thomas leaned forward. At the top, in bold block letters, ceremonial reinstatement, honor guard assignment, posthumous, and beneath that, custodian of record Lieutenant James M. Moore, USMC recognized Mr. Raymond E. Navarro. He looked up slowly. "You're saying," Thomas swallowed, "you're making it official." The scarred Marine nodded. "Navarro didn't just remember Moore. He said he carried him." 2 weeks later, Hillrest National Cemetery opened its gates before dawn. The sky hadn't yet broken from black to blue, and already a line of Marines stretched across the ridge, dress blues pressed, rifles shouldered, boots shining like obsidian. Thomas stood in the back row. He didn't know how many people would come. But as the sun rose, the road behind him filled slowly at first, then like a tide that wouldn't be held back. Teachers, students from Hillside High, veterans in old ball caps and newer prosthetics, church ladies holding hand-painted signs, a group of high schoolers in ROTC uniforms, standing rigid in the wind, and near the front, a young boy, maybe 10, he held a letter in both hands, folded and worn, as if it had made a long journey tucked inside a boot. Thomas watched him step forward. A colonel bent down to meet him. The boy spoke quietly, then handed over the note. The colonel read it, nodded solemnly, then waved the boy past the line of Marines escorting him himself to the white tent where Raymond Navarro's photo stood on a black easel. The boy laid a single dandelion at its base, then turned to the headstone beside it. James M. E. Moore, 1st Lieutenant, USMC 1944, 1968, never forgotten. There was something new beneath the name, a second line, freshly etched in granite, and to the man who never forgot him. Thomas blinked hard. He wasn't the emotional type. But this wasn't a funeral. This was a reckoning. A country remembering not just its warriors, but the ones who remembered them. The ceremony began with a low hum of bagpipes, the slow, steady echo of feet marching gravel. 3 volleys fired in perfect rhythm. A riderless horse passed by, black coat glistening in the sun, boots reversed in stirrups. A flag, once folded by hands now buried, was lifted once more, creased by history, crisped by honor. But what broke Thomas was none of that. It was a small, wax-sealed envelope, retrieved from Raymond's belongings, carefully placed atop Moore's grave. On the front, in faded handwriting, "You're not forgotten. Not this week." A young corporal stood to read a citation. Raymond Elias Navarro, she began, voice trembling slightly, served as an unofficial custodian of record for Lieutenant James Moore from 2013 to 2023, without compensation, without request. His consistent acts of remembrance fulfill criteria outlined in Title 10, Section 772, regarding continued military honors rendered by civilian parties in absence of next of kin. She paused. In short, she said softly, he did what no one asked him to do, for a decade, and that was enough. Then came the letter. The boy stepped forward again, this time escorted by his mother. He held it out to the officer at the podium. "It's from my dad," he said. The officer unfolded it carefully. "My father served with Moore." The officer read aloud. "He had PTSD for years. Wouldn't talk. Wouldn't sleep. But then he saw a photo of an old man kneeling in the mud beside a forgotten grave. And he cried. And he spoke Moore's name out loud for the first time in 30 years. The officer's voice cracked. He said, 'That man's the reason I'm still here. The one who kept watch when the rest of the world forgot.'" The crowd was silent. You could hear the wind move through the trees like breath. And so, the letter ended. We called him the Watchman. The sun rose higher. The casket remained empty. Raymond had already been buried. But this was the moment that sealed it. The general stepped forward, removing his cap. He saluted not toward the crowd, not toward the cameras, but toward the grave. And with a voice worn by years in combat and loss, he said one final thing. "We speak their names or they disappear." He turned to Moore's stone and someone kept speaking. That afternoon, long after the crowd had gone and the last folding chair had been loaded into a van, Thomas walked back down the slope toward the easel. There was no press left, just wind, just light, just silence. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the notebook. Raymond's. The one recovered from his trailer. Inside were dozens of letters, written each Sunday, all to the same man, all signed the same way. "Your friend, still standing." Thomas placed it gently on the grave, then stepped back and saluted. Not as a cop, not as a witness, but as a man who had been changed. It didn't end at the cemetery. The bagpipes quieted, the uniforms folded away, the honor guard boarded their buses. The news crews packed up, one by one, chasing the next headline. But something lingered, a stillness, a reverence, like the world had taken one quiet breath and remembered how to hold it. 2 weeks after the ceremony at Hillrest, Officer Thomas Baylor stood in the back row of an auditorium at Millvale High School. The principal, who used to roll her eyes at the janitor with the limp, now stood on stage beside a blown-up photo of Raymond Navarro. Not the one of him lying at the grave, the other one. The one where he stood alone in the hallway with a mop in one hand and a broken chair in the other, head down. Sleeves rolled, back bent slightly from years of work. A student snapped that photo during finals week 3 years ago. No one paid attention to it then. Now it hung 12 feet tall, framed by American flags. Above it, a banner. Raymond Navarro Honor Assembly, service through silence. The kids were quiet that day. Not bored, not restless, just listening. Their generation didn't know Raymond. They knew hashtags. They knew echo chambers and filtered noise. They knew how fast the world forgot things. But here was a man who didn't forget. Not for a week, not for a season, for 10 straight years. No cameras, no followers, just flowers and loyalty. Thomas watched as one student stepped forward, a junior named Ethan Marks. He held a bundle of wild marigolds in his hand. "I didn't know, Mr. Navarro," he said, voice cracking slightly. "I didn't even know there was a graveyard out on Route 19, a pause. But I read every letter he wrote. They're online now. There's a website." He glanced at the screen behind him, where the final page of Raymond's notebook was displayed. One sentence, scrawled in shaky ink across the bottom margin. "The watch ends, but the memory stands." Ethan swallowed hard. "So I started going. Every Sunday, A pause. Not just me. There's a group of us now. We bring flowers. We read names. We sit. Not because we knew them, but because we owe them something. He looked out at his classmates and then added, quietly, Mr. Navarro didn't just watch over a grave. He watched over a generation that forgot how to remember. At West Point, months later, Raymond's story became part of the first-year orientation module on honor and legacy. They called it the Navarro Standard, a reminder that not all duty comes with a chain of command. Some comes with silence, and a folding chair, and a promise kept long after the last bugle fades. The grave itself changed too. Lieutenant Moore's stone now bore two names, his own, and the one etched beneath it in quiet italics, and to the man who never forgot him. Every Sunday, flowers appeared, some placed gently by school children, some tucked beneath trembling hands from old Marines, some mailed from across the country by strangers who'd never stepped foot in Millvale. It wasn't about the grave anymore. It was about what it meant. Thomas went often, not in uniform, just in jeans and a jacket. He never stayed long. Sometimes he'd read one of Raymond's letters, left laminated beneath a bench by the memorial. Other times, he'd sit in silence. But always before leaving, he'd whisper the same words. 6 words, the same ones Raymond whispered every week for 10 years. You're not forgotten. Not this week. One crisp morning in spring, a group of cadets from the Naval Academy made the trip to Hillrest. Among them was a second lieutenant named Kara Lane, 25, sharp, steady, former foster kid, first in her family to serve. She stood before the grave with her cover tucked beneath one arm. Lieutenant Moore, she said quietly, we don't know your voice, but we know the echo you left behind. She paused, and to Mr. Navarro, her voice faltered. Just a moment. He didn't just guard a grave. He guarded a memory the world was too busy to carry. A long breath. That's what leadership is. She knelt down and placed her insignia pin at the base of the stone. Then she stood and saluted. Back in Millvale, Thomas still had the key to Raymond's trailer. No one came to claim the property. After the ceremony, a few students had asked what would happen to his things. Thomas hadn't known what to say then, but one rainy afternoon he unlocked the door, stepped inside, and just stood. Everything was still there, neat, precise, lived in. The calendar still read September. The coffee tin on the counter still held 2 folded napkins. His uniform jacket hung on the back of the chair. The wire glasses were folded on the windowsill, just where he left them. And beside them the notebook, the one with every letter. Thomas opened it to the last page, and there it was. No date, no salutation, just one line, faint, final, but resolute. The watch ends, but the memory stands. Thomas closed the notebook gently, then looked out the window, past the glass streaked with spring rain. The wind was moving through the trees, soft, slow, reverent, like it knew something had been passed on, and this time someone was still listening. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.